This is Embodied from PRX and WUNC. I'm Anita Rao. Dina Gilio-Whitaker knows that talking about Native American identity is messy. She's in a gray area with her own tribe as a legal descendant who doesn't qualify for enrollment. She was still processing this ambiguous identity when she encountered a troubling phenomenon: people coming forward with false claims to nativeness.
It never occurred to me that people would lie or that people would make up some story because they had some romanticized vision of what being Native was.
Today, a deep dive into Native ethnic fraud. Dina shares what she's witnessed personally and her research into how the phenomenon started, plus how these fake claims to Native identity cause real harm.
Native Americanness, we have been conditioned to believe it is a racial category, but in fact, it's this political relationship.
That conversation just ahead on Embodied. Ask Dina Gilio-Whitaker to describe her Native American identity, and here's what she'll say.
So I'm really in that gray zone.
Dina is a legal descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes. She has family ties to the Colville Reservation in northeastern Washington state, but she doesn't qualify for tribal enrollment. She has access to some benefits from the federal government, but not others. Dina has been making sense of this liminal space her entire life. And at the same time, she's witnessed massive shifts in the cultural conversation around Native American identity. And there is one particular phenomenon that has caught her attention: people coming forward with false claims to nativeness.
What I observed was people coming out of the woodwork to claim that they are Native without necessarily even knowing a tribe or having a relationship to a tribe. They were everywhere.
Dina watched this phenomenon grow over decades, and then, after becoming a journalist and academic, witnessed the fallout up close. This experience led her to some big questions. Why does Native ethnic fraud happen? And what are the stakes? This is Embodied, our show about sex, relationships, and health. I'm Anita Rao. News stories about people pretending to be Indian have become more frequent in the past decade, with allegations coming out about folks in academia, publishing, and Hollywood. As Dina watched this wave of pretendian accusations build, she was at work on a book about the complexity of Native American identity. She hoped to shift the conversation about ethnic fraud away from call-out culture, and she wanted to help people understand the history of this phenomenon, its impact on Native people, and what can possibly be done. The now published book is Who Gets to Be Indian? And it starts with some context about her own identity and family story. Dina was born at the end of the baby boomer generation and raised in Los Angeles. Her dad was the child of Sicilian immigrants, and her mom was of Native and white ancestry.
Yeah, it was complicated. My mother grew up in Washington and was connected to her tribe. Much of her life was spent on the reservation as a child. But she leaves that area in the 1950s, moves down to Southern California, and meets my father. It coincides with this era where the federal government is actively trying to push Native people off their reservations in what's called the relocation program. So I was raised mostly around this large Sicilian American family who were loving, good people. But they were also people who really didn't know about American Indian people. There was no lack of affection, but there was a lot of stereotypes. There was a lot of misunderstandings of my mother, for example, and her drinking problem. My mother, to set the context for that, my mother had grown up in a family that was shaped by trauma, the historical processes of being colonized and having everything taken from them. This is what shaped who my mom was. Nobody in my Sicilian family really understood it, so my mom became scapegoated.
Well, I want to take you back to the lessons that you were learning from your parents. You were raised away from the space where your mom grew up, but you did feel really connected to your Native heritage, even though you didn't really have a lot of exposure to it. You were 12 and your family took a road trip to the Colville Reservation in Washington State. Tell me about what it was like to visit the reservation and what your relationship was with your Native identity as you were coming of age, entering your early 11, 12, 13 years.
I had grown up very clear about who I was. I mean, my knowing that my mother was a Native person, she was an Indian. And it's also a time when, things are starting to shift around our own national narratives about it, with the ethnic pride movement. And so by the time we get to that trip that you're referencing in 1970, we get to the reservation, and I just felt some deep connection to the land. I was only 12 years old,
Hmm.
but there's something unnameable about what it means to be a Native person and to be in your homeland, to be in a place where your DNA is connected to a landscape and to a people that is really hard to put words to.
So you have this experience of kind of coming of age during the Red Power movement. There was activism led by Native youth. There was messaging about pride in being Native American. And then as a young adult, you moved to the Bay Area. This is in the early 80s. And we're amidst a burgeoning new age movement and a really interesting time when this kind of rise of urban Native communities and this melting pot of people of a variety of different tribal backgrounds was coming together. Tell me about that and your exposure to this interesting kind of melting pot, how that shaped your emerging understanding of what it meant to be Native.
I end up, as you say, moving to the Bay Area in 1987. So I'm in the North Bay Area. And this is a time where the counterculture is morphing into this whole new age movement. And the counterculture turned its attention to Indian country and to Native Americans, where there's a valuing of Native culture, and the Back to the Land movement gets infused with all of that Native wisdom, the medicine people, tribal knowledge, all this kind of stuff. And that's a good thing. Like, it's the first time in American history that there is this, actual respect for Native people and their cultures. But it does become fetishized and it becomes commodified. And so this is what I find myself in the midst of. And what I observed was this urban Indian population that's people from a lot of different tribes and these people with these very ambiguous claims. And of course, there's no system of checks and balances in urban situations like that. People aren't asking for your tribal ID. If you're coming and saying you're from whatever tribe, nobody's going to ask you to show your identification. And so there's a lot of trust. There was a lot of just open acceptance of people.
Is there a story that comes to mind for you of like a firsthand interaction you had with this wannabeism in this era?
Oh my God. Well, I knew a lot of people that had such a story. And it never occurred to me that people would lie
Mm.
or that people would make up some story because they had some romanticized vision of what it being Native was. I had a lived experience, and the lived experience was really harsh. So, now I question, like, why would somebody want to make up something like that when our actual experiences were so difficult? It just, and it plus it's rude. Like, if somebody's going to come up to you and say, I'm blah, 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 tribe, it would have been seemed rude to me to ask them to prove it or to ask too much. But of course, now I think that it's incumbent upon us to press people for their claims.
I want to ask about the kind of transition from that time period for you because you were living kind of in this melting pot environment. You were engaging in a lot of kind of native cultural practices, but you were also becoming more politically activated and really reckoning with questions about your own family's story. And then in 1991, when you were in your 30s, you did go back to your family's reservation. Is there a question that you needed an answer to, or something that you were searching for that you needed to go back to find?
Oh, very much so. I was at a real turning point. And, early 30s, that's a turning point for a lot of people. And for me, it was at the end of a marriage. I was questioning everything about my life and who I'd become. I had been in two failed marriages where I had been subject to domestic violence. I had
Mm.
been abused. And I'm trying to find out, why is that? So I'm asking these deeper questions, and I knew that it was going to come. I was doing family systems work. I knew that I was going to have to figure out my relationship with my mother and what is it about our family system and my mother that can help explain that. I was starting to learn about what it meant to be the adult child of an alcoholic. And so I knew that in order to get the answers to those questions, I was going to have to go back to the reservation and look for those answers myself. And, I had uncles there, I had relatives there. And so it was with that intent to uncover this family history so that I can understand myself better.
How did the answers that you found shape your relationship with your Native identity on both a personal and a professional level?
So what it was for me was, this is the first time I hear the story of the boarding schools. And my Uncle Vern tells me about Chimawa. So Chimawa is one of the notorious boarding schools in the Northwest in the state of Oregon. And so my grandmother, Uncle Vern, and Uncle John had all three been sent there. They were her brothers. And he tells me the story about the abuses that they all suffered and how they all tried to run away, many times, and they never made it. The stories about, being kids and being drilled with rifles, being dressed in military uniforms, being subjected to corporal punishment, all of that stuff was really shocking to me. And I felt enraged by it, and I felt like I had been lied to my whole life. This
Hmm.
feeling of, like, why did I not know this? Why doesn't everybody know this if this is our history? And I became committed to, I'm going to spend the rest of my life re-educating myself so that I could tell what I am learning to everybody I know around me, and commit to re-educating as many people as possible. And so that's what I did, and that's what I do now.
Just ahead, Dina comes across a major case of ethnic fraud and tells us the whole story. You're listening to Embodied from North Carolina Public Radio, a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You can also hear Embodied as a podcast. Follow and subscribe on your platform of choice. We'll be right back. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. Today, we're talking with Dina Gilio-Whitaker about Native American identity and pretendianism, the phenomenon of people falsely claiming Native heritage. Dina is a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes and a lecturer at California State University, San Marcos. She's also the author of the book, Who Gets to Be Indian? Dina first encountered pretendianism in the 1970s and 80s. In that era of the New Age movement, there was frequent appropriation of Native identity and culture. But the phenomenon didn't rock her personal world until about 3 decades later, when she became acquainted with the actress Sacheen Littlefeather. Littlefeather is best known for taking the stage during the 1973 Academy Awards to refuse an Oscar on behalf of Marlon Brando.
He very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award. And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry.
Littlefeather claimed Apache and Yaqui heritage and became an icon and activist for Native causes. In 2016, Dina was tapped to ghostwrite Sacheen Littlefeather's memoir. But early into their work together, Dina started having suspicions about Littlefeather's claims to Native identity.
She had been contacted by a literary agent in New York. They were soliciting a manuscript from her, and so she needed somebody to help her write it. And I had just published my first book, so we started working on that project together. And through that process, I conducted hours and hours of interviews with her on a preliminary basis as we were developing a book proposal. And in that process, she handed over a journal. She had been keeping a handwritten journal. There were 200 pages of this journal. And so she gave me 200 pages of photocopies of that original journal. And so I had all this information in there, and she mysteriously pulled the plug on the project, but I still had this journal, and she didn't ask for it back. And so I just sat on it. And, a few years went by. I start to get communications from other people as I talked to people about my experience with her, which was very bewildering for me.
What were the red flags? Like, what was bewildering?
Well, the red flags was how she completely just disregarded me. And so I started to think, well, maybe it was because she found somebody better that's a better writer, or that she would rather work with, or, I had nothing to go on. And so I started just talking to people about my experience, and I started to hear rumblings of people who said they thought that she was a fraud, and there had always been these whispers, and I was unaware of that. And here I had this journal, and so the journal is actually a treasure trove of evidence for her. I actually came to believe that, if in order to write a book about her life, especially with me, it was going to require, brutal honesty, a lot of family details. And I believed that she was not going to be willing to go down that road and answer some really tough questions. And so turns out not long after that, a couple years after that, there was a documentary that had come out about her, 25-minute documentary called Breaking the Silence. And it's terrible. It's a terrible documentary. It doesn't have any new information. It's her repeating her same tired narrative of her story, and definitely no hard questions about her own, supposed Native background. So I just became, all of these things added up over time that I became convinced that she was not who she said she was.
So, in addition to this personal experience with her and this conviction that you had that she wasn't who she said she was, simultaneously, you decided to kind of wade into academic and scholarly research about this phenomenon of ethnic fraud. And you did it knowing that it was prickly territory inside academic circles, inside Native circles. Why did you want to lean into the conversation?
Well, it's something I had been writing about in my previous book, As Long as Grass Grows, which is a book about environmental justice in Indian country for Native people. I wrote about it there when I wrote about the history of the environmental movement and how it became infiltrated with the counterculture and with fraud in there. Although I didn't go directly into the fraud, I was definitely concerned about the fetishizing of Native people in that movement. So with the experience with Sasheen Littlefeather, as I became convinced that she was not who she said she was, and I had this journal of hers, this where there was evidence. I just felt like I knew I had something, and years went by. I knew I was going to have to do something with it. I didn't know what, but it just sat there on my bookshelf for all these years. And then when she passed away in 2022, 2 weeks after she passed away is when this bombshell article came out written by Jackie Keeler exposing her as a fraud based on the testimony of her two sisters. That's when I knew the opening was there. This was a bombshell. I mean, it rocked Indian country, and people were not happy about it. People do not want to hear their heroes are liars, especially in Indian country, because we have so few heroes to begin with. But it's something that we have to confront. And I just felt like I was in a hot seat. Like, what do I do now? I felt like I was put into a position I could have ignored it, I suppose. I could have just not engaged, but I felt like I was handed this thing, and I felt like I had a certain sense of responsibility to expose what I knew because this problem is so big. I mean, the fraud in her case was so blatant that it can't stand. We can't allow it to stand. And that's the stand that I took on it. This is an opportunity to really have a serious conversation, to move the conversation from what I call out culture, because that's really where we're at with it. In social media and our social spaces, we get righteous indignation about people that we believe are frauds or pretendians. And not that that's wrong or incorrect, but that we need to get beyond that. We need to have a serious analysis, a serious conversation about the phenomenon, about how we get here, and how we move through it in a way that's productive. I'm not the only one to feel this way. They're the work of other scholars who have, tried to advance this, but my goal was to lay a foundation that's historically informed and can offer some, hopefully constructive advice moving forward or suggestions.
So I want to talk briefly about that history of how pretendianism began. And you argue that to understand it, we must look to early Hollywood. What was happening during the early film industry that led people to start claiming that they were Native?
The early film industry is a time, so if we're talking about the late 19th century, early 20th century, of course, this is the era of silent films. The film industry comes directly out of, in one regard, comes out of the Wild West shows. The Wild West shows were, like a Buffalo Bill, Cody's Wild West, and there were numerous other of these shows. They were quite an American phenomenon. They were these spectacles that demonstrated the American stories of the winning of the West, and so they were populated by veterans of the Indian Wars. So these people who had become prisoners of war basically get drafted into these Wild West shows, and they travel around the country and around the world, especially Europe, performing these Wild West spectacles. And so this is during a time when Native people are confined to reservations, often not allowed to leave. Native religions have been banned. You're not allowed to practice your religion. Your lands have been allotted. They have been privatized. And Native people have been thrown into bitter, horrible conditions of poverty and sickness. And it's a really dark time for Native people. But what they can do is they can join the Wild West shows and travel the world and get paid really well. So it's not a bad opportunity for those who, with the skills, coming out of these Indian wars. And it's in this era that, so nativeness, I argue, this is the point at which Native identity becomes commodified, because now it's the first time where you can be paid to perform Indianness. And why wouldn't you in this time if you could? It's a way out of a very difficult situation. And so the film industry comes out of that. Some of the earliest films are within these Wild West shows, and it morphs into the film industry. And so some of the earliest film topics were about Native people and this, the vanishing Indian trope. It was many of those themes were about we have to, honor the Native people. Their cultures are vanishing. It's the vanishing race. And so this trope was being played out over and over again. And some of the earliest actors in those films were people, veterans of the Wild West shows. And so now nativeness is fully commodified. You can make money by performing nativeness. And by the time it hits the film industry, it's Native people mostly doing those roles, but the process of being made up to look like an Indian, everybody had to go through it. It was a very artificial process. You can be red-faced, as it's been called. So you didn't need to be native, an actual Native American person, to be red-faced. Now it's opened to anybody. So that's the moment that I pinpoint as being the origin point of pretendianism as we know it today.
So historically, folks in the entertainment industry had a financial incentive to pretend they were native to get certain roles. As we move through time, what else did you uncover about why pretendianism occurs? Why are people pretending to be native when they're not?
It comes down to a number of reasons. Lots of these people who are out there publicly claiming themselves to be Native Americans, especially those that don't have any kind of connection to a tribal community whatsoever, they take resources away from actual Native people. And it's especially acute in academia, in the entertainment world, in the publishing world, and in government contracting. So we're talking about massive amounts of financial resources that get diverted away from the people that they're actually designed to benefit. So the financial incentivization is there. But by the time we get to the mid 20th century, we start to see the shifting of values. Our social values are changing. We see the civil rights movement. And that's the beginning of this ethnic pride movement that starts to sweep across the country. People are no longer as ashamed to be people of color. You know, the Black Panther movement, the American Indian movement is taking shape, the Brown Berets. This is a moment where people are starting to turn away from whiteness and claiming their ethnicities. My argument is that there are psychological benefits, and that there always have been from the beginning of really American society, where we begin to see the origins of cultural appropriation, to use an older term. So there's a lot of reasons why this happens, but it's rampant, it's systematic, and it's done nothing but grow.
So I want to ask about that self-identification, the implications of it, because I know, that has really become the norm, starting with how the census was done. That's how people apply to jobs now. And I'm a mixed race person. And as I was reading your book and thinking about this, I was like, oh, for me, overall, self-identification has been a good thing. It's allowed me to express myself more fully. It's allowed me to kind of express myself, even if people don't see my heritage when they look at me. But it is much more complicated when it comes to Native identity in particular. Tell me more about how you personally became to understand that distinction and why self-identification is much more complicated when it comes to talking about who's Native and who's not.
Self-identification is what gave us Sasheen Littlefeather, and what gave us Iron Eyes Cody, Buffalo Child Longlands. These are early frauds in the Hollywood business. And I can go on and on and on to name you the frauds that we've had to deal with in academia, in entertainment, in publishing, in government contracting. Self-identification does not allow for any processes of accountability and transparency. Being Native American is, I argue, it's a political distinction. Native Americanness, we have been conditioned to believe it is a racial category, a racial distinction. I would call it a false distinction. That's been thrust upon us. Being Native is something that is a relationship on an individual basis. It's a relationship to a tribe and a tribal relationship to the United States. That's a political status and distinction. And that's the way that Native people started to relate early on to Europeans and then the American government. But it became racialized, a racialized category over time. But in fact, it's this political relationship. The racializing of Native people is what has led to so much misunderstanding, but it's also led to the attacking of Native people and a systematic attempt to dismantle tribal sovereignty. That's a whole other conversation. but that's what I deconstruct in the second chapter of the book.
Can you give me an example of what's at stake if we continue to talk about Native identity as a racial identity and not a political one, just to help us kind of have something to latch onto?
Yeah, this is the sort of the crux of the problem. There has been a sustained effort to dismantle tribal sovereignty forever, forever. Anti-Indianism has never left us. The processes of colonization has always been about eliminating native populations and taking their lands. That's just the history of this country. We are left with less than 5% of our lands, but we have this legal structure in place, and that's what's unique about the United States, is that hundreds and hundreds of treaties that the United States made with Native nations have left us this legal structure where the federal government has agreed that it has a fiduciary responsibility to tribes to protect their resources, to protect their lands, and to guard this relationship of responsibility. It's called the trust responsibility. And so this is roughly the scaffolding that we call tribal sovereignty to protect Native rights and Native lands. Well, one of the ways that this has been done in the legal system is through protecting against the taking of Native children. The boarding school history, 20th century history of children being taken away from parents, which happened in my family. That's a whole other piece of this story about how my mom had a child taken from her before I was born. That was part of my discovery of my mom's history. Anyway, it leads to the Indian Child Welfare Act. It gets passed in 1978. This ends the systematic taking of Native children and placing them in white adoptions. Well, that law has been considered the gold standard in adoption law. It's also been called one of the strongest laws that we have to protect Native rights. And that law has been under attack for well over a decade now by conservative interests led by a group called the Goldwater Institute, backed by a big law firm called Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. The goal is to undermine, if not completely overturn that act. Why? Because it protects tribal sovereignty. As long as you have this framework of tribal sovereignty in place, that protects what remains of Native lands and resources. And so this systematic attack on that law, legal minds have said, if that is undermined or undone, it becomes the thread that can unravel the entire foundation that protects what rights Native people have left and ability to protect their lands.
Just ahead, we'll hear Dina's proposed solutions for combating ethnic fraud in Native communities and how doing all of this research has affected how she thinks about her own Native identity. Stay with us after the break.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.
This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. Today we're talking about ethnic fraud in Native American communities with Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Dina is a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes and the author of the book, Who Gets to Be Indian? Dina argues that pretending to be Native American is more than just an issue of cultural appropriation. Pretendians can take jobs and financial resources away from the Native people they were intended for. And broader confusion around Native identity chips away at tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation. So what can be done? One solution Dina proposes is moving away from policies of self-identification, where people just declaring that they're Native on forms or in interviews is enough. But that also gets tricky because some folks who do have legitimate claims to Native ancestry don't have all the legal proof. This is how Dina makes sense of that tension between being in a legal gray zone and wanting to limit self-identification and ethnic fraud.
So my personal relationship to it is difficult because until my tribe, the Colville Confederated Tribes, changes its rules for enrollment, which is based on blood quantum, based on the documents that we have. I can't prove that I have a quarter Indian blood to be an enrolled member. And a lot of tribes are moving away from this blood quantum standard and adopting what we call lineal descent. Lineal descent acknowledges kinship and family connection to a tribe, and that's a much closer to an indigenous way of understanding what indigeneity actually is. And so until and unless my tribe adopts that standard, I will never be an enrolled person. I will be in this space of liminality. And so, but I still care about it, even though this is a tribal sovereignty matter. I believe that this is an exercise of sovereignty, even if I can't be an enrolled member of my tribe. I support my tribe's right to establish whatever rules it wants, even if it means that I'm sacrificed in this process. And I want to read from the book in the end of chapter 2. I make this argument. There must be a baseline by which we determine, name, and inhabit the paradoxical relationships we now find ourselves in the United States. In the language we inherited from our English colonizers, we call it tribal nationhood and sovereignty, framed as they are by legal structures not our own. Whether we have clearly documented tribal lineages and enrollment within a federally recognized tribe to which our native identities are legally tied or not, we should care about these processes and relationships because without them, there are no Indians that the state is bound to recognize at all. There would be no tribal land bases or treaty rights that the state is legally bound to protect. Without those legal realities, colonial though they may be, American Indian people are just part of the multicultural mass that the U.S. prides itself on. Without legally defined Indians, the state evades accountability to the original people of this land.
So you have this interesting tension in your own personal experience. And there are a number of different realms we're kind of talking about in this conversation. We're talking about the public spaces in which people self-identify and have access to various scholarships or jobs or opportunities. We're talking about tribal enrollment and the relationship with a particular tribe. But when it comes to pretendianism in particular, and this kind of first sphere of people pretending to be Indian and the implications that has, what are some alternative models for validating claims? Like, how can we not fall into call out culture, but actually have a productive conversation and look at this in a productive way?
Well, we need to have honest conversations, frank conversations about it. We have to not be afraid to question people's identity. We need accountability and transparency, and we need systems in place in our institutions.
Well, I wonder about what processes can exist that won't cause more harm. Like, do you have ideas or specific examples of processes you think would work to kind of further the ability for folks with real heritage to get these opportunities, but not cause undue harm?
Well, I would say that there's already a lot of harm being caused,
Uh-huh.
and the harm being caused is because of self-identification. People claiming, because they have the right to self-identity, claiming the heritage of something that they don't have a right to claim. They don't have, and that's not true for everybody. I mean, so we have to talk about the very real existence of this big gray area that a lot of people, for countless reasons, can actually be legitimately Native people, but not be able to prove it, right? Through
Mm-hmm.
adoption and through all kinds of other processes. So we have to be able to acknowledge that. But at the same time, like there's a conversation there. And so we have to be willing to have those conversations. In academia, there is no reason why we shouldn't ask people coming into, say, for example, an American Indian Studies department, applying for a tenured track job that has a claim to Native identity, why shouldn't that person be asked to be accountable for those claims? It would be very similar to asking somebody who is coming in from out of the country to show their immigration status, right? Like it's showing, what is your nationhood? What is the evidence for that? So there's lots of ways.
What are some examples of proof that allow for the accounting for folks who have that history of forced adoption, who have that removal, who maybe cannot get that tribal enrollment card? Like, could you give me some examples of questions that could be asked or things that could be considered in the process of validation that would account for some of those disruptions?
Yeah, I mean, I have siblings that would be in that position. I have three siblings that were born before I was. They had all been placed in adoption. So now these folks have a legitimate tribal heritage, but they have no documentation. They'll never be able to get documentation that connects them to our tribe, whereas I do. But they have a story that they can tell. If they ever want, and this would never happen, but if they wanted to apply for a job or some other kind, be in some other kind of position where they would assert that nativeness, they have a story to tell. And so when I talk about processes of accountability in a place like academia, that's a story. Like, this is something that somebody can tell. Like, we're open to everybody's stories. We like to hear these stories. If you don't have the documentation, your family was impacted by adoption or some other kind of process, but you know that you came from a Native family, then tell us.
Hmm.
What is that story? And then if you've got some way of validating that story, great. But when I'm asking for processes of accountability, this is just one. It's not like, you don't have to necessarily prove your heritage through a document, because there's so many ways that that's not possible. But account for your story. Tell us who you are. Tell us why we should believe you.
And what's the role of kinship in this and the ability to kind of, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing when you say that is I'm thinking about those examples of stories where people say, oh, I have a great, 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 great grandfather who was Cherokee. Like, that is not exactly a story that you would consider to be a valid one, I'm guessing.
That raises questions about, what does it mean to be an indigenous person, to be native? So, okay, what if you can trace back 400 years? And there are lots of examples of this out there. People who have stories about, and even like in their genealogy shows a native person 300 or 400 years ago. But what's happened in that interim is that there's been lots of intermarriage. There has been no maintenance of relationship to a tribal culture or to a tribe. And so now here you are 400 years later, going back to claiming this native ancestor, but you have no kinship. You have no relationship to that tribe. Like, what does that claim mean? Is it valid? Well, you have entire groups of people that are doing that now, that have done this deep genealogical work, in Canada. And here I'm talking about the scholarship of Daryl LaRoe. That's his specialty, interrogating those Canadian genealogy tribes. And we have lots of them here in the US too. And so the questions are like, well, what does it mean to claim nativeness, even if you can show that you have an ancestor from a long time ago? And so the way that I argue it in the book is that the way we describe that matters. Like, words matter. Just because you have an Indian ancestor that you know about from hundreds of years in the past, is that license to say, I am Native American. It's one thing to say, I am Native American, when you have a connection to a tribe and a family, these kinship connections. It's one thing to assert that, and it's another thing to say, I have an ancestor from 400 years ago that was
Hmm.
native.
Yeah.
And so words matter.
So after all of this research, you've kind of come down to this idea of kinship and community as really important things to define your connection to Native identity. How have other folks you're in community with, especially those with more ambiguous identities or complicated family histories, responded to this idea?
So there's mixed responses. I think most Native people would agree, and let's be clear. I mean, my scholarship builds on the scholarship of other people who have said this. Being Native is about this kinship connection. I'm not saying anything new here,
Mm-hmm.
but there are people who don't have the kinship connections that are still very married to their ideas about their family lore, their family histories, where there is not necessarily any evidence. So they're not going to give up those stories easily. That's where I see the resistance comes from for the most part, needing to hold on to this, whatever that is, the romanticized family stories about Indian ancestry that are unvalidated or unverifiable. I think those are the people that are going to have the hardest time with these arguments.
How has researching the pretendian discourse affected how you think about your own Native identity and where you are in your relationship to it at this point in your life?
It's just strengthened it because I know that even though I don't have that little enrollment card, I do know the value of my descendancy status as a legal designation. I don't have as much anxiety or, yeah, doubt about that as I used to. I maintain my connections on the reservation. I go home. I am involved in the culture, but I know who I am. I know my kin. I know my history. I know who my mother was. There is absolutely no doubt about where I come from. And so I've learned to decenter this idea of blood quantum and having a certain amount of, quote unquote, blood to define who I am as a Native person. I know it's a false narrative. And so I'm much more confident about that now. Because I do believe that it's the kinship that's the important piece and the maintenance of community with the tribe.
So you're putting this book about ethnic fraud out into the world, and in it you were really vulnerable and revealing aspects of your own family story along the way. I'm curious about what you feel like is at stake for you personally and how this conversation about Native identity evolves and what your hopes are for how the conversation continues.
My hope is that this book will be a foundation for people to be able to talk about this issue with a lot more honesty and frankness. And that was the goal of writing the book, to just create a conversation. That's why in the subtitle I use that term, difficult conversations. These are very difficult conversations, but I'm not one to shy away from a difficult conversation. And I think that we can have these conversations in ways that are logical, they are measured, and if not non-emotional, at least just balanced. So that's the stakes for me. I don't want to be the one to call somebody out, but I do want people to talk about it. Like if you're going to come into my space, and in my American Indian Studies program at school and talk about being Native, well, I want to hear you talk about it. Like what is that story for you? I want you to feel safe to talk about it and also to feel accountable about what it is that you're saying.
Are there things that have helped you be able to tell your own personal story? And I guess what are the biggest factors and the things that have helped you be able to do that at this juncture?
I I think it has a lot to do with the scholarship that people have done before me. There's a literature on this. People have done some really difficult work. Not all of it has been received well, but it's been done for the right reasons. For people to be the scholars before me who have done the hard work that I just get to build on, that really helps me. And the people that I know in my life who are also in liminal positions. There are so many people like me who have this liminal identity that are Native, they grew up Native, but they don't have the benefit of tribal enrollment. We are a dime a dozen in Indian country. And so having the conversations with those people helps me to be able to deal with my own difficult feelings about it. So I'm much less insecure about it than I used to be. And I think, being able to talk about it in these terms will also help other people work through their own insecurities.
Dina, thank you so much for the conversation and for sharing so much of your story and your work. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time.
You can find out more about Dina and her book, Who Gets to Be Indian? Ethnic Fraud, Disenrollment, and Other Difficult Conversations About Native American Identity at our website, embodywunc.org. You can find all episodes of Embody the Radio Show there and subscribe to our weekly podcast. Today's episode was produced by Kaya Finlay and edited by Amanda Magnus. Wilson Sayre provided additional editorial guidance. Nina Scott is our intern, and Jenny Lawson, our technical director. Quilla wrote our theme music. This program is recorded at the American Tobacco Historic District. North Carolina Public Radio is a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Anita Rao.